begin with a brief introduction. When I was asked to do something like a roundtable or a discussion, they asked me, well, what artists would you like to convene with? And I thought a little bit, looked around a little bit, and I was completely perplexed with Diana's work, and that's the wonder, the affect, and the lack of comprehension was part of the seduction. But the actual proposal to speak with her is kind of like Tinder. You have to go through an app, and you may be rejected, but she didn't reject. So that was a good thing, because it brought us together in some kind of dialogue that is totally unrehearsed. But we shared a couple of texts and a couple of works along the way. So nothing that we're going to say tonight is something that we've rehearsed before. But I was impacted by two readings that she gave me. One of which I'll cite is by de Souza. What's de Souza's first name? Aruna de Souza. And everybody frames Diana's work in the architectural context, but de Souza does so in a way by framing what architecture is in order to understand what Diana isn't. And that architecture is somehow about premeditation. In architecture, you create a plan, and the building, the project, becomes a manifestation of something that's already been rehearsed before, and that there is, and I don't know what the right word de Souza uses, but it's the becoming is not part of it. What is the word that de Souza uses? It's almost like your work is all about something that is it's projecting forth something. And that got me to think that obviously there is a truth in that. Right? Even if you look at the legal frameworks of architecture, everything, insurance, everything works around premeditation. And yet, the space that de Souza carves is about intuition, happenstance, working on accidents and things like that. And that got me thinking about what is it that we do in architecture. In architecture, we do two things. Not everybody, but at least that's the way I think that we do it. You work on objects, and yes, for objects you have to know everything, where everything goes. But the more interesting part is when you develop a system of relationships. You author a system of relationships that you can actually give to somebody else, and they can create something different with it. And so almost everything that I will present in the pairs of slides will have something to do, not with, I mean, they all end in a building or in an object or in a space, but the reality is that I could have given those to Diana, and she could have done something completely different with them. Therein lies something that I see that there may be a connection in our work, is that yes, architecture deals with function, yes, we have to put mechanical systems in it, but those are not the interesting things to discuss here. There are qualities that have to do with the means and methods of fabrication and the materials that you're using that are predisposed to becoming in different ways. So within the context of this project, Casa La Roca, which develops a brick screen wall, the invention really is nothing other than what we call the variable bond. Brick walls have bonding names like running bond, Flemish bond, which give a dimension to the mortar dimension between two bricks. Within the context of this project, and this drawing, this animation that you see to the right was done about 20 years after we did it by hand, meaning it was not numerically done. This is something that I learned to do many, many years later after we'd done everything by hand. But essentially, it establishes a variable dimension that allows you to corbel and to expand and contract a brick wall so that it is structurally self-sustaining, but also invites the passage of air and light through its membrane. And so the promise of this is that it's not part of this project, but it's a system that envelops a space, any other space that you could be working with. Now, what I like about Diana's work is also, it also occupies a historical space outside of itself, whether it's in mythology or whether it's in history. I like to think that architecture has this capacity to speak to individuals and architectures that are long forgotten or have yet to be born. And so the project that we did in Melbourne that establishes an iconic object, this is the studio space in Melbourne School of Design, framed by the actual working desks and all of that. It's, you know, the only architecture school that doesn't work horizontally but vertically. All of the workspaces are stacked against the dedicated studio that's suspended in there. And, you know, in the Tempietto, you know, I like to describe that as an idealized object against a medieval fabric that, you know, includes the basilica, but the monastery and other buildings that are part of the organic sort of development of Rome around it. In Frank Gehry, he has to invent his own fabric so that the zoomorphic figure that is contained within the interior is rendered more affective than it maybe really is. It's just a boardroom. And what Kahn does in the center at Yale is establish a meaningful tectonic relationship between the drum and the structural frame of the building, albeit conventional. What we turn sideways in the context of Melbourne, whereby we use the structure of the roof from which to hang the studio space. And so a massive coffered span that spans about 100 feet with a depth of about 8, 9, 10 feet, depending on how you look at it. Slanted coffers so that you don't get direct sunlight, but natural light. And then it's an inverted tectonic because normally you build up. Now you're building down with massive timber members that become a veneer by the time that they're suspended down, hanging in tension, contorted, contrapposta as it were, in the space. The affect that is part of the convolution, part of the undecipherability, and part of the enigma of your work is also another thing that I don't think that in architecture, at least in our work, we can capture in photographs. We try to and all of that, but it's something that requires experience. And in the context of the Tenderham Bridge in Melbourne, the actual bridge is only used for 2 weeks a year. That's when the Tennis Open is there. Nobody else goes really to the Tennis Open outside of that. So the architecture of that bridge has nothing to do with what's above it, but the trellis work that supports it underneath. And you can see that the filigree that is rendered from raw rebar, bent and fashioned in different ways, is a manifestation of the maximum moment. And so somehow this structure is participant to the structural requirements of a bridge, but the experience that it exudes is about a kind of ephemeral tracework, a network of things that are more associated with nature than they are with, let's say, the architecture of conventional buildings in the context of Melbourne. Now, sometimes systems are two-dimensional, other times 2.5 dimensional, like extruded coffers. In this case, a fully 3-dimensional module of a column in the round, in the context of Helios House, is able to distort to capture loads that are asymmetrical, to flatten to become the billboard of the project, or to become the pay station. And so the problem with this project in Los Angeles was that we couldn't design a new gas station. We had to work with the existing structure, but the codes required that we cantilever farther for this or that reason, or the program required new amenities that the old gas station didn't have. And so somehow these distortions are the manifestation of an existing condition mediating with the new forces at work. And of course, nothing was premeditated in this form. It's almost a frozen moment. Might I add, almost ugly. Well, that's the point. And that's my introduction to the end, is that a lot of our work, let's say, has worked with presumptions of canons of beauty. But when you do a beautiful system, sometimes the object that it produces does not fall squarely within those canons, and this does not. And so this is the other entry into your work that I really like, and it has to do with the grotesque and how the grotesque may become a cultural challenge to our classical notions of beauty. So, and I'll try to end with that on the final slide, but let this be an introduction to that prompt. They are the materials themselves, and the materials have a direct relationship to means and methods. The grain of the wood does something, but the way that you cut the wood does something else, and it gives three-dimensionality and therefore structure to it. And in the context of this structure for the immaterial, ultra-material exhibit at Harvard, we were able to create a three-dimensional bowstring truss using the veneer of wood as the bottom chord of that structure, movable, malleable, yet structural. The entire edifice emerges out of sartorial techniques. The darting is something that is not part of architecture. It's something that we borrow from externalities. And so being able to occupy the mentality of other platforms is a central part of our ability to occupy different traits. In this case, for the Biennale at Gwangju, we were supported by a local metalworker who builds door handles. And, you know, we were able to basically get free door handles for the construction of a structure that avoids, let's say, the predictable systemic tectonic orders of column, entablature, beam, but rather through random densities, I say random, no, distributed densities of what needs to act in compression, what needs to distribute loads, and what needs to span. Those densities are manifest in the way that each bar is located arbitrarily in space, for which there is no drawing, there is no calculation outside of densities that we would weld and then go back in shape to produce a structure of variable densities that is in some way in dialogue with the existing trees and the urbanism around. The aggregate within the context of Frank Lloyd Wright is innovative. In this context, we go from the smooth surfaces of an interior, inverting the cement to stone aggregate density as we go into the landscape to produce a wall that is conceived completely differently in dialogue with the landscape. And in this case, the idea of the grotto comes into mind because it's a building that is smooth on the outside, but goes into these kinds of aggregate conditions on the interior as you go into the kind of interstices of the courtyard. And sometimes you have an idea that is innate to a certain material. This is a structure that is conceptualized around thin concrete shells of Felix Candela, but for one reason or another cannot be afforded and are then translated into steel that they require a thickness and depth, what is a kind of massive Rubenesque plaster surface, but that we also have to navigate what in architecture is called value engineering, but to see that not as a terrain of compromise, but really as another avenue for transcending the circumstances of material limitations. So I end with this because of going back to maybe what I think or I perceive to be an entry to the aesthetic prompts of some of your work, and a space in architecture that is what I think is the other of architecture, whether that's nature and the difficulty of being able to build nature into architecture. You asked me for the Ledoux thing. I don't know if it's going to show up in your thing or not. And the relationship between the grotto and the grotesque as a category that invites us to rethink aesthetics and cultural canons altogether. So I'll hand it off to you.
Gosh, you're speaking my language. Actually, it was so hard because when I was doing my deep dive into Nader's work, I was trying to, everything I was reading, every other paragraph, every, I don't know, part of your manifesto, for example.
Right.
I could think of a project of mine that I felt had a relationship or spoke to it. So, going off of your grotto.
I'm going to sit there and I'm going to come back.
Okay. So, I usually start by showing this work because it's a very early work. It's from, I was an undergraduate. So I'm going to show two while I was in school. Anyway, so thinking about mono-materials and thinking about creating a constraint. When I was in school, I didn't really want to make, standing objects, seem like very old-fashioned. I wanted to think at a larger scale, past my peripheral, past my arms. I wanted to make installations, places. I think a lot of people would call it architecture, but I never felt like that was fair or appropriate. But anyway, whatever it is. So this was my first kind of a big learning lesson about the nature of the materials that I gravitate towards, or the kind of forms that feel innate, whatever, to some compulsion that I have. These are made of, it's a paper plate cave. It's called plated cave. So paper plates stapled together to create these planar forms that had a lot of structural strength, and it's all that it was. I actually got the idea from my mom, who would make me Halloween costumes out of paper plates when I was younger. And 1 year I was a pumpkin, 1 year I was a princess. But it's like a very easy to recognize, accessible material. And when you're in school on a limited budget, it was very easy to make this. But of course, even though it was a repetitive process, it didn't automate a repetitive form, really. Each section was kind of funky and looked like hand-built. It was very imperfect. So this is soon after that. When I got to grad school, I kind of succumbed to learning about traditional sculpture methods and materials. So I started working with plaster, welding, fiberglass. So that was a cave, and so this is the exterior. This is the mountain that you can't enter, but you always kind of look at. It's called Immodest Mountain. And I had this kind of zipper that was kind of pulling the mountain apart, and little cast Victoria's Secret underwear. So I'm jumping way forward. This actually opens in a couple days in Michigan at the MSU Broad. And one of the many things that I think we have in common in our work is porosity and like wanting to kind of barely touch the ground, or kind of have magic, illusion, things that kind of contradictory. That was my train of thought. Anyway, I start with the ground a lot in my sculptures, and I think about extruding. So this piece in the back is called Spun of the Limits of My Lonely Walls. And I made it, it's obviously the most literal architectural sculpture, so I had to put it in. But it also taught me a lot about again, enacting like a method for making or building forms from the start. So my kind of directive to myself was that I would put paint on the soles of my feet and dance the walls. And wherever my footprints would hit the floor, that would be kind of the blueprint from which I would extrude the building. So of course, it created this kind of diamond pattern, this very like irregular building that's like a building made of a body rather than a building, for a body. And then of course I turned it upside down and scorched it. So the materials are like wood, foam, fiberglass, plaster, of course. So like I'm also very interested in simple materials, building common construction materials, common sculpture materials. I don't tend to use a lot of found objects or ready-mades. I don't know why, but so that's the pattern of the footprints, and I kind of cast my footprints there too. And so that was made, right side up and flipped upside down. And then many years later, I had this remnant of a sculpture, and I guess that's the closest I get to a found object. But I made that piece by holding it, by hanging it upside down, and like basically throwing material on it for years. Sometimes I wouldn't work on it for a long time. Sometimes I would, but it would dry, and then flipped it right side up, so it kind of looks a little electrified or something. But there's an old sculpture buried inside there. Anyway, so just thinking about how you talk a lot about building from the top down or from the bottom up, and I think that's something that I think about a lot, as well as building from the inside out or the outside in, like establishing a parameter, whether it's a method of making, or if it's a literal parameter, like a circumscribed area on the ground that will kind of determine the shape of the sculpture. So I find that I work between one and the other. And then, improvisation, it plays a big part in my work as well, in large part because of these horrible, realistic constraints that we all have to deal with, that architects might have to deal with a lot more. But this was for a biennial. The Charlotte biennial was like their third biennial, so it was very early on, and there are always like these big, complex, art like monsters. There's so much involved. There's so much coordinating and shipping. And this was like the 10th idea I had. I was working there on site, and I had come in with this almost fully realized idea, which was really not good. And as I think back on it, I won't tell you what it is, but it was like I think I was kind of like anxiously trying to kind of get ahead because I was going to have to make something on site, and I'm a studio. I think in the studio is an extension of my mind, and so it's very hard for me to work without my common patterns and materials and spaces. Like it's really hard for me to work on site or not to really visit a site well enough before I make something for it. So anyway, I found that they had a ton of construction materials, and you can see this thing started as this kind of mountain in the front here that had kind of erupted, and then I just welded this tower out in the field. And I was thinking a lot about too, another thing that I read that you said that about drawing. You said drawing. I think you said drawing is already a construction.
Yeah.
And that makes so much sense to me intuitively because I don't do a lot of preparatory drawings. I think through my hands. I think through making. So anyway, I just shared this piece because it's sort of like an extruded drawing again. The platform, this is a figure, you can kind of see at the top, a reclining figure. I have a lot of like reclining figures in my work. This big horizontal platform that's tilted is a spiral galaxy. And at the top, another thing that I really related to is like the seamlessness of our materials. And I always want to I find that I always want to make it hard to tell where the beginning and the end is, or else be very direct about where the beginning and the end is in a work. So, all my work really is a matter of constructing, I think, lines and planes. I don't know, you can boil it down to that, I think. So these, at the top are all these kind of lines, these fluid fabrics, and then just a mass of these hanging strings. Again, thinking about like hiding the structure in order to make you question the structure, like is another, I think, thing that we have in common, to kind of like bring the structure to your mind, like how is this standing? And it's pretty obvious when you stand in front of it, you can see that the legs, there's many smaller legs. So I also thought a lot about how your use of you're speaking of figure and ground, and your and how the body is a container, right? Like that we understand the world through metaphor, and that knowing that we live inside, that we have this boundary that's our skin, instructs us on how to understand, more intangible things in the world, if that makes sense. So just thinking about containers and self and what history can hold, or anyway. So this work was based on an existing cast of a person, and then pouring the material over and letting it kind of run through, and then I got really into pedestals as well as a kind of like as a kind of thing to react to, because I always do need something to react to, and I think architects have so many prompts that are immediately like you have to respond, but artists have to kind of come up with their own problems, and whether it's material or some artificial construct or something, some way to proceed. And so me, for many years, it was a matter of starting with the pedestal to make a floor. So so this is another kind of drawing is a construction work that I wanted to include. It's called Citadel. As sort of a nod to the Citadel of Aleppo, which is the city that I was born in, which I studied for a long time. But this is it's actually based on a painting, and I also do borrow from other art forms a lot. I try to like superimpose the logic of painting onto sculpture in some ways, or vice versa. So this is like an extruded painting. It's called Allegory of Chastity. It's by Hans Memling. And I remember the mountain. She's basically wearing, this figure is wearing the mountain as like a hoop skirt. It's like as a chastity belt, which I found hilarious. The scale is really funky. She's like huge, and she's wearing this mountain skirt. So anyway, I also love to kind of play with scale and kind of confuse scale, or it's always something on my mind, whether it's like a grain or a galaxy. I'm always kind of trying to get as extreme in scale in some ways. But anyway, this was made by taking the mountain, that the kind of chastity belt from the painting, and painting it on the wall, and just like literally putting up metal rods and extruding it from the wall by welding, just standing in front of it and welding pieces over and over again. So really just building it in real time with no plans. But as I'm going into it, I discover this kind of the organizing principle, or this kind of like internal logic that I think I got from Memling. I think that there was some way in which, I wish I had the painting, but there was some kind of way in which this line work was bound by some kind of rule that I think I figured out, and as I was kind of copying him. Anyway, that's something I like to do, is copy older artists. So this might be like the closest thing to your work in ways, maybe like the Gwangju biennial piece, and also like a drawing as construction. So this was for the Lahore biennial, and it was another situation where I, was thinking of what do I have like access to there, and it's there's a ton of materials, lots of cheap materials, and a lot of cheap labor. I didn't want to just like make a sculpture independent of the location and like ship it over and plop it down in place, of course. But I also wasn't really used to working with a big team. I don't really give direction to other people. I always touch my work, myself, and so it was really hard for me to kind of figure out how to make a work with almost no instruction, because I don't have a lot of instruction when I start my work, so I didn't know how to pass on no instruction to someone else and get a sculpture out of it. But I tried. I tried. I made this little drawing, and I sent them that. I said, I made this. So the goal was, to get as much of this material as possible, and I set up, from the, you can see on the floor plan, these kind of clusters that they would then group 7 to 15 per cluster pieces of metal, and then whoever was building it could bend it in some way, not to exceed a certain amount. And then when they would cluster together, wherever they would kind of brush against the other material, you drop a weld, and then some horizontal bracing where needed. And this was based on a really cool. This is the Punjab archive, so it's a record of the city's history. And I was visiting when I was doing the site visit to figure out what I wanted to do and where. And I learned the story of this building. It holds the body of Anarkali, who's a famous figure. She's like this, she was the mistress of she had like an illicit affair with the crown prince, and was sentenced by his father to be buried inside of a wall. And so the building has this aura of her presence, and there's like a sarcophagus of, that supposedly has her body, but also it's in a wall. I don't know, it's very unclear. Anyway, so the site was where, it was kind of like where the royal family lived. So that was where I kind of transplanted this building. Kind of wanting to make, this building is like very solid, so kind of wanted to make it very porous. And this is another, this presentation is very like anachronistic. It's not very not linear. So this was kind of in the era of when I was collecting pedestals to build cities or civilizations from. So this was me trying to figure out like a group logic, or like I was looking at a lot of like mannerist paintings, like Contorno, and like these kind of like, contorted limbs and bodies that were always like intertwined and enmeshed, and I kind of wanted to separate them. And so in the spirit of those paintings, I had some friends, again, very relaxed, really important to me, that their composure is very, very relaxed. And then put them above this kind of grid of collected kind of building pedestals. And then they sort of became gods, because of this scale being so strange. And then I kind of retrofit this, ziggurat-like structure. And just like the immodest mountain piece from so long ago, the piece also started in a puddle, and then grew into mountains, and then sort of started to delaminate, and then you could kind of see the underside was very cavernous and cave-like. This is another piece in the kind of category of me trying to kind of extract what I can from painting, or from the pictorial world, maybe, or from, just trying to understand like what is color, what is, these very simple things that to someone like me, I've really had to learn more about paint. To this day, I don't feel like I feel like I know more about welding than paint, although I paint a lot. But anyway, I digress. So this is also from a painting that I saw at the Prado, and I was really captivated by this cloak, this ornament that kind of was painted with sort of disregard to the contours of the fabric, in some points, and I took it into Photoshop. Oops, sorry. Okay. I took it into Photoshop, and I used my favorite tool, the magic wand tool, and it erased all of the non-ornament from the cloak. And this was an opportunity for me to work with at UT Austin, so I could use their facilities. I was sort of in residence there. So they have this like CNC router or whatever, and I'm not typically use those things, but this seemed like a really fresh opportunity to try to make this ornamental thing a structural column. So that was kind of like my first goal. I don't know if I succeeded very much, but here it is, kind of extruded. And then kind of taking the rest of the geometry from the painting, just thinking about how do I pull all of the paint drips off. Like, how do I delaminate the paint from the image in a way? So I made all these kind of these various dimensions of various cubes. Each cube had a specific dimension not shared by the other. You know, I sort of set up all these rules just to kind of build the space from the back. And this kind of reminded me of your it's like perfect cube kind of happened on its own. But this piece really taught me about, you know, this material, and from there I realized like I could actually try to make a painting of sorts, since now I know how to control the colors, I control like the drip. You know, for me, when I'm working with this, it's a material that's like, it's more like, okay, so these are more the panels, I call them. They're like a cast painting. It's almost like a combination between fresco and tapestry. So from the front, it's more fresco. From the back, it's more woven together. And it's fiberglass. There's steel. And I think another similar thing that we share is that, you know, for me, it's really important that the structure follows the surface. The structure is in service of the surface of a thing. I never lead with the structure. I don't know what the structure will be until I know what the narrative is, or what the image is, or what, you know, it's always kind of in response to something a lot more esoteric and something a lot more improvisational. So in a way, I think of myself as working like ass backwards all the time, to kind of retrofit a logic, or superimpose this logic onto something very logical, I guess. So I figured out how to kind of like get these colors to suspend in space, and then I realized that I could kind of control them to make images, and then that kind of unleashed a whole body of work, two of which are in the show, and just, you know, playing around with colors and histories, and in this case, making a room. This was at the National Gallery Victoria in Melbourne for their triennial. So inside, I got to use the artifacts from the museum and make work in response to it. I've never had that, like, these objects that, you know, kind of made a work to hold their objects. It was pretty cool. So I chose this genus that normally isn't allowed to be on the ground. It's always on a plinth, but I wanted this feet to be closer to our feet. But because I had it kind of protected, they let me put it on the ground. Okay, so this is the last thing I'll show. It's technically not open yet, but and I'm technically not done installing it yet. But I'm just going to show you the parts that are done. So this is the Princeton University Art Museum, and it's called Cigarette Splits the Sky. And it's very much, you know, in response to this beautiful building that's just, you know, they're just going to open next month. I actually don't really even know how to talk about this thing yet, and I think that's pretty common when I just finish something. So maybe I just won't talk about it. So that's it.
So maybe I can lead with a question.
Okay.
I commonly refer to our work as a balancing out and a struggle between figurative and configurational work. In architecture, the figure commonly emerges out of a well-known type, a building that's recognizable in some form or another. If we say basilica, we understand that there are recognizable parts that it has without over-determining the image of the building. But the figure is always there. But the majority of our work goes into configurative studies, meaning that we are dedicated to looking at bottom-up explorations of materials, means and methods of assembly that in some way or another tend to mute the figure, abstract it, semantically displace it. And my sense is also that it's a borrowed trauma that architects have had, at least of my generation, of the over-determination of meaning in postmodernism, using history as a crutch. The reliance, you know, the kind of the over-reliance on iconography as a way of communicating meaning. But what's interesting about your work, or at least from an outsider's perspective, and I don't know the debates in which you're involved, but there's an evidence that there is a co-presence of you know, mimetic work, classical sculptures, figures, completely discernible, and then either intersected with, veiled by, grounded by a more enigmatic play of material that, for lack of a better word, I'll call, you know, abstract, expressionist, or things that don't immediately amount to semantic matter. So there's, you know, the modernist paradigm of, you know, material at play, and there's the classical paradigm of, you know, mythological figures that come with a cultural baggage that is to be communicated, and the conflation of these two produces compositions that are not, in my mind, readily discernible, and so they escape common understanding. So could you help at least place us in, you know, where is this a debate for you? Is this something that is this tension problematic in art or not really?
I don't know what else is going on in other people's heads, but I think I know what the debate is that you're talking about, but I don't know if it's a debate. I think that I just kind of embrace all of it, because I think, well, first of all, like you, I'm fascinated by typologies, right? Like I tend to go between figurative architectural landscape, you know, figurative architectural landscape. I'm always kind of like going between these three, you know, triangular kind of typologies, and but always thinking about how to gut them or stretch their form or kind of confuse them. But there's always, I think, a lot of times this clear, recognizable thing. But of course, I work in the modern age, and these materials are like, you know, they're only like 10 years old. Some of, you know what I mean? They're not, maybe a little longer, but you know, they're even though the forms look like classical, or them like clearly referring to old master paintings, you know, these works would never exist back then. You know, it's very, very much of, you know, it's like super contemporary. You know, that even sculptors ask me, what is this material? Like, you know, so it's a new material that I like them invent another iteration from. So that's, I think, why it's hard to recognize or identify what it is, even though it's like pretty commonly used. But I think, like you, I find that, you know, working with these common materials that we know and we recognize and are part of our material culture, you know, pushing what they can do, or trying to get them to do what they can't do, right? Which I think, you know, of course they end up doing it, but you're kind of testing the boundary, right? At what point is this going to collapse? But for me, I don't think you can maybe ask that question in your work, but for me, like, you know, that line of it having enough strength to hold itself up, but just that much is kind of that line that I play with. But going back to this question about like the debate, I think that I've discovered recently, especially in working on this last project for Princeton, because it's the biggest, well, I don't know technically, but it was more complex, and I relied much more because it's permanent. I relied much more on like engineering and, you know, fabricators and computer design, which just killed me. Like, it was a real struggle because I cannot think if I don't know the tools that I'm using. So if, you know, I was this close to taking like a Rhino class just so I could get in there, because I'm sitting next to this person who's like, you know, I'm like, okay, move this one drip over
Not John.
not Sean, no God. I've not survived that. No, like someone I paid to like, you know, help me design this thing in the computer, and it just seems so inane to me because I'm like, why can't I just go make it? Like, I can just make it faster than you're designing in the computer. So anyway, but what I learned from that is that the way that I arrive at my work, it's pretty uncommon that I conceive of it like at one time and then kind of one of the few is that Upside Down Cathedral. That's one of the few works that I do feel like just dropped on my head and I kind of saw it and then I kind of made it the next month. But most of the time I'm doing kind of, I think what Runa was talking about, which is like figuring it out as I go, sometimes leaning on narrative, sometimes leaning on material, sometimes leaning more on a question I have about history, sometimes a question I have about, you know, a material property, if it can combine with this other thing, and what would happen, you know, if, how can I relieve more weight from, you know, this, whatever. So, it's really more, I imagine, like what a writer would do in creating a novel, where sometimes I know the setting, sometimes I know the characters, I kind of know the tone and I know the way, you know, but as I'm going, if one thing shifts, like with Princeton, there's so many, you know, realities that would hit. If it's a budget, oh, well, if the budget won't allow me to split the entire thing like open like an egg, then what does that mean for these other proportions of actually, you know, it just, every time something changed, the entire story changed behind it. You know, every technical obstruction, every mechanical issue, every time that there was a no or a redirection, the entire story changed. So, I mean, I don't title my work until the last day, like the day it's done and maybe then some, because I really don't know what it's going to tell me, and I don't really know. But it's a real, like, you know, labor of trust to work with me, because I kind of don't do proposals very well. You know, it's kind of counterintuitive to, it's actually the thing that I think really separates what you do and what I do, because I couldn't tell you enough. Like, it's very hard to satisfy, you know, people who are like looking at these things, and I don't ever send out proposals. Like, someone has to ask me, you know, to think about this site or whatever, and then, I mean, the stuff that, I don't know how they go for it, because I look back and I think, I cannot believe this drawing passed, but, you know, I have to show them all the other work that I do, but it's like, it's very hard because I can't reduce the scale of my work. It like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, I can't illustrate that surface in a model and make it make sense. I have to use these shorthands in the model, like, okay, insert droopy wall here at this scale. You know, so you can't really visualize it, and people have such a hard time, like, you know. But of course, at the end, like, that's how it, like, I'm sure you also encounter that because there are certain realities, of course, a budget will, right?
Part of my question emerges out of a debate that was very much present in our own education, where readings on modern art and kitsch were a central part of how they found their way into an architectural moment, which I would say was not described by things that are taught today so much, because everything was so semantically laden and about what the image communicated. And it reminded me why the trauma that I described earlier had to do with finding processes, protocols of construction, and a way into the construction industry that evaded entirely the reliance on either typological thinking or iconographic thinking that was so central to our education. And maybe and all of that was cloaked with the specter of kitsch, that if something is too recognizable, it is a one-liner and it's over, right? And so that the work of art in some way or another needs to have a quality that continues to, defer meaning and release associations, but that you can never center it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because your work occupies clearly two genres, but doesn't center it, I was just curious if this, on the one hand you have a quality that is purely ephemeral, completely enigmatic, and you can't photograph. You can photograph it, but it's not the same as inhabiting it, right? And then there's another quality which has to do with very well articulated historical figures that project forth through experience, and whether that's I was wondering, is that even a discussion in art?
So,
But it doesn't have to be.
well, hold on, I gotta bookmark that for a second. But, so are you saying that when something is recognizable, it risks being kitsch?
Right. That was the argument
In architecture.
in architecture. Right? Again,
Yeah,
I'm also I'm aging myself. This is
No,
40
I
years
fully
ago.
understand. Like, I fully understand. I mean, I grew up, my teachers in college, were types that would paint circles for 40 years,
Right.
over and over.
Right.
So, like, I fully get it. But, I, like you, come from a tradition that is deeply narrative and deeply ornamental,
Right.
and deeply, figural and of course there's so much abstraction as well. But when you go so deep into this, like, that modernist kind of obsession, it's a little it's a little tense, it's a little like, Adolf Loos, like, oh God, is ornament really a crime? Like, is this a big problem? I remember thinking like it was so offensive because, like, on the one hand, we would make these trips to New York and go to these beautiful galleries, these white cubes, and it just felt like you were in some kind of like heaven, no visual interruptions, just like purity, and then I would go to my mom's living room, and it's like plush couches with like, ornament everywhere from like all the places that she traveled, and that was home, that had character, that had history, that had a feeling of personhood, a feeling of intimacy, and I love them both. So how to reconcile those two things? For me, it was never really an option just to be an abstract artist. I don't think that it ever. In a way, a lot of my works appear abstract, but they start from a source. They start from something that I once knew, and I might erase it or erode it, but I can't start from I can't just take a canvas and start with circles. Like, to me, that's redundant. You know, I would just as sooner start with something else and erase it. And you know, there's so much metaphor in these methods of working. You know, this that I think can kind of be depleted if you kind of take out all of the context that they presume to want to take out. I don't know if that's
So what you say resonates for two reasons. One, it's in relationship to one slide, you brought up the agency of the surface as being a central figure in what you're working with. And I'm reminded of, I'm not sure which Mark Wigley's essay, but the argument goes something like this: that in modernism, the assumption is that the structure is the architecture and the skin is ornaments, or superfluous in some way. There are also gendered readings of this that in some way that structures everything. But there's an alternative argument that says that in fact the surface is everything and the structure is in support of the surface. And a lot of our work, as you noticed from the first slide onwards, are structural skins, and quite literally so. But they're there also to debunk the narrative of architecture as being a real thing that's cloaked. In fact, it's often exactly the opposite. And it has to do with this idea that tectonics, the definition of tectonics is not actually what the reality of architecture is, it's what the narrative is. So when you talk about the antithesis of a column, the kind of the bulge is a representation of weight, it's not the actual weight acting on it. And I'm reminded of also a moment in our own pedagogy when I was drawing a brick wall for some project, when my teacher, Rodolfo Machado, brought up Eladio Dieste, who is well-known Uruguayan engineer / architect who did many voluptuous things with brick, but really from an engineering standpoint. And he said, instead of looking at this, which is great, how come you're not looking at your own tradition and not being, a well-grounded Iranian? I went to the library and I sort of did a little bit of.
Did you grow up here?
I grew up all over the world and a little bit here, but very little time in Iran. So, let's say I'm a foreigner in Iran, but nonetheless, an Argentinian prompted me to look back into Iranian architecture. And in looking at it, I was reminded of the fact that, in Islamic architecture, particularly, the figure is taboo.
Yeah.
So
you have to find ways to work around it.
Exactly. So
but not
the brick, the tile can look towards calligraphy and to nature as a way of embedding, encrypting the figure in there, but not in the way that Western art or architecture would do.
But yet there's so many incredible miniatures, Persian
course.
miniatures that, of course, like when I realized, because I was raised Sunni, so from day one, when I was in high school, I was like drawing these portraits, and my mom, one of her friends was like, and I was like, why? Why? It's not the whole body. And even to this day, I hold this superstition, like I can't have the whole body present. It's like I can't have the head.
There's a tradition of even more explicit figures in this.
Oh yes, totally. But that was like a moment when I learned about the other Islam that was making figurative work, and that was captivating. So much of my work comes from those things. But something you said that made me. Is it true that the Corinthian columns, the story is it's a woman? like there's a figure in the column. I remember that from something. Right, because it's ornate. It's like ornamental.
I need to look beyond me, but the caryatids are certainly an embodiment of the figure, the human figure, as a
like of all the orders, like the most ornate one.
Yes.
Is like the feminine. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think that the capital was inspired by a sculptor who saw like an overgrown like votive on a grave, right? I'm just remembering that and thinking about how, you know, like how much ornament is gender. When you said that about it being gendered, it made me think of, you know, even it's just hidden in so many places is something that we just assume, you know, like all of these, like our traditions are somehow not as, I don't know, like, I don't know. I mean, it's a problem that anyone who grew up in the West has. We have to, like, make a concerted effort to learn about our you know, heritage. Like I also didn't take any Islamic art classes, you know, there weren't any when I was in school. I didn't, you know, it was like 2 days in like world civilization, you know, that was it. So, and for me, I don't know if it's the same for you, getting a little personal, I resisted a lot of that influence. I think because, you know, I was such the token, like, non-white person in all my classes. You know, I was a token Arab, token Muslim, whatever. They knew who I was. And there was this pressure to like comment about that. Or a lot of times where it would be read in those terms. And I even still, like, you know, regardless. And so it, you know, for a long time, it really bothered me, you know, because I don't want to be reduced to the, whatever, I want to be a representative of, you know, especially this kind of imposter syndrome of like, well, I wasn't even from there, really, I didn't grow up there, you know, but like, of course I did, I grew up in my mom's living room, you know, like I grew up among all of it, and I, you know, I feel it in the news, I know that I'm from, you know, even though I grew up here, but I resisted that, like, that education and that, you know, that integration of the culture in my work, because I didn't want to be tokenized. So it took a long time to kind of realize that actually all of these concepts, they're rooted in Islam. You know, like this is these form, you know, it's not, you know, so anyway, I lost my train of thought again. I'm sorry I keep doing that, it's been long.
It's fine. It's totally fine. I wonder if we want to. Yeah. Okay. Frankie says it's time to open it up. So we'll open it to the audience. Yes.
Hi. This is a question for both you, Diana, and also Nader. And we could talk about ornament or form or skins or structure. But I was curious of what's the role of human experience in your work, and specifically thinking to a project from Nader at Northeastern, a meditation space where I really experienced like a real unique space, which was full of ornament and form, but I felt like it was intentionally provoking something. So I was curious if this thought plays a role, or if it's purely a consequence of the sort of spontaneous art or concept involved in producing the architectural art.
So I went full circle with the question of experience. The first books I read took me through phenomenology as a general student before architecture, and it all seemed fine, but I didn't understand the polemic behind it. Then when I went to architecture school, it was the days of structuralism and post-structuralism, where other systems through linguistics and other frameworks were imposed on architecture that gave me a way to understand that architecture, like language, is a way of communicating, and therefore it's a shared lexicon, and which objectifies everything, and the experience, any discussion of experiences is in the background. And then finally, rereading some of those texts by the time I went into my later years of education, realizing that a lot of the phenomenologists have a kind of touchy-feely, ephemeral quality, and I still to this day dislike that discourse. But the moment you start building, you can't deny that you're innocent and ignorant of what it is that's on your table and what it is that's out there, and how can you calculate when something is too low or too high, too heavy or too thin. And the Northeastern Chapel is a great example because it was our first construction. And for the people who don't know it, it's not a very large room. It's in the core of an administrative building on the second floor with absolutely no light. A space that was multi-denominational, but in the 50s and 60s that meant to the different Christian faith groups. So the moment that there was an arrival of a more international student body at Northeastern, Jewish, Buddhist, Muslim, and so forth, it wouldn't be able to operate in the same way. And so the task was to restructure a space that was not A, coded in terms of Christian iconography, and B, had the flexibility to orient itself towards the east, the west, or centralized conditions, and then invoke the possibility of transcendence. And for people who don't know the project, it's basically a glass room, frosted glass room, with ornamental glass, not ornament in the traditional sense, in a very modern, abstract sense, that hides the fact that it's a dark room because there's lighting behind it. But because you don't understand the depth of that lighting, it produces the possibility of infinite light or completely contained light. And then, of course, there's the kind of, and that was the first moment where questions of gravity, your work talks to this also, came into it, is that we realized that we either need a hung ceiling, much like this gallery has here and here with diffusers, and we learned about this idea that the dome itself, if perforated, could become a plenum space that just leaks air into the space. And so those domes, which have a kind of ritualistic function in orienting you towards Mecca or the opposite ways, are actually a foil for all of the mechanical systems. But it's the experience of the weight of that bulge is something that I believe you can't aptly photograph. It's something you have to be in that space. And so it really changed the way that we work. And so from that moment, we went from architectural drawings to models and then immediately to mock-ups. The mock-up became not something you even do on site. It's something you do in the studio because we realized, and also because I was never a builder. So the construction of these mock-ups became a mechanism to grapple with the difference between means and methods on your table and means and methods out there. The roughness of a brick, the alignment of two surfaces, the misalignment, and all of that. So I think you hit it dead on. That experience has emerged as a central preoccupation in a lot of the projects.
Could I translate your question?
Sure.
As are you asking if I think about my audience?
Absolutely. I think my question is, how considerate is your process or the storytelling or the form of materials as a presence in your process of creating something, how prominent is that intentional experience or implied experience, or is it completely spontaneous and up to the viewer to interpret?
Well, I mean, of course everything's up to anyone to interpret. Everyone has free will, but I am laying some clues in. But I guess like I don't really need to think of other people in my studio because I have a body and I can experience the spatial relationship between me and the object without importing some other fictional human, you know, into the studio. Because I know, like I can estimate what the experience is going to be like for other people because I'm living in it. So I just try to be responsive to my own instincts, really. I mean, I think the furthest I go is like, you know, am I going to feel backed up against a wall when I'm looking at this? Does it tower over me? Do I sink into it? You know, all of those things, but, and like, where is it going in the end? You know, is it going to be, you know, when it's an installation, you know, touches a wall, you know, so how does a person walk into the space? Of course, I think about those things, different points of views, but that's as far as I go. I don't really, it's not pleasurable for me to think about what other people want. This is the one place that I can determine make my own decisions with no one saying no. You know, like that is like the biggest gift, you know, that an artist has for themselves. And I think that that's the function. If you're authentic and you're honest about what you're interested in, that's the function that can have for you. It becomes a mirror for the problems you're dealing with in your life outside. And you may not realize, like, I realized that kind of recently. Like, I was like, oh, I've been putting it all out there. Like, all of the things that, you know, all the scratches I want to itch. Like, one day I'll walk in and I'll be like ready to attack something, ready to break something. Another day I want to sit diligently and like work like a miniaturist, you know? Well, why? You know, where is that coming from? That's coming from something that happened that day or that week, some way that I need to process, you know. And I think that gets translated. You know, when you are right up against a painting and you see the mark, you feel someone making that mark. That's that connection. So if that person's not making that mark in all with total authenticity, then that connection is disrupted because you don't feel it when you look at it, I think. So I don't really think about it.
I understand. Thank you.
Hi, thank you both. It was a great conversation. But my question is for Diana. I've always loved how you, as a museum person who is on a daily basis confronted with the problem of a pedestal. Now you too. I've always loved your troubling of the pedestal. And I know that work. And I wish we could redo the whole galleries with Diana's pedestals instead of our pedestals.
Oh, we could do that.
I didn't think of that soon enough. But the work I didn't know is the work that you showed. I think it was Melbourne, where you were able to use works in the collection, and you had that. You could see it as a frame, but to me, I sort of saw it, and I'm wondering where that came from for you, as an extension of your. Like it was almost. You said the work was taken off its pedestal.
Yeah.
Was that an extension of your work? Your thinking about pedestals?
I mean, I guess in a way, like a pedestal is meant to repel you.
Yeah.
It's meant to control your distance and relationship, your point of view. It can be high, it can be low. You know, there's so much embedded in a pedestal that you know, that's why I wanted to work with those first. Like I literally got some from someone else's show and brought them into my studio. So I had like a small civilization of pedestals. And each one I would make a sculpture from, not knowing what the story was. So in a way, I wish I had the other side. This is half of the installation. The other half is like this big garden. It's like an encircling garden. and behind them are you know, bracelets and little artifacts that might have been found in the garden. But yeah, I guess in a way, this is, yeah, I could see it as a kind of a protection, but it's also not, it's not really presenting the object in this heroic.
Well, that's the
way.
thing, it's, the concept pedestals is they trophieize.
Right.
Very, which is a
Right.
problem.
Right.
So what you're doing is you're creating a pedestal that doesn't do that, and you're actually almost recontextualize, you're giving the work its own sort of, maybe not authentic or original,
Privacy.
sacred context, but the pedestal sort of built around it,
Yeah.
and it's no longer a pedestal. I just found it really beautiful and fascinating.
Yeah, I just thought maybe it's like a privacy.
It's like a baldacchino.
Yeah.
In case.
Yes. But it's, yes, and it's just, I connected the two, and I just wanted to say I love it,
Oh, thanks.
because it just does something,
I
so.
mean, you know, the opportunity was like, you have access to this whole collection, and you can present them how you want as long as they're safe, right? I mean, I had to fight for that one because they really don't want it, you know. You can't-
Yeah, no, I get this.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, that's what I'm saying,
Yeah.
I
So it
understand.
was like a workaround, you know,
Yeah.
because I really wanted it to live in our space, you know, this is,
Yeah.
but also, you know, the painting that this is based on is in their collection. So I extruded, you know, made a room of the painting, and instead of hanging the painting on the wall, I put it flat on the pedestal, which is another thing I had to kind of fight for. Like, because I was like, well, you never see a painting horizontal, you know, you never have to like hover over it to, you know. So I got to do a bunch of fun things with the objects in the museum, just to kind of like make us approach them differently, or to kind of shield them and, you know, create a fiction around them that, you know, let them kind of like play a role in a performance or something.
Yeah.
You
No,
know?
that's it, and it's not literal, but it's more authentic in a way, in its own. It's more organic. We're starting over. Go beyond this part.
It's not too
And we're
late.
both fired.
And we're on fire.
These come up and down, so don't worry.
The conversation is not over though, because we can have wine next door, so please join us, and thank you to our speakers.